The Liberty Weekly Podcast, Episode 12.
It is the most unintended and awkward consequence of our military offensive here in Afghanistan. The rout by our Marines of the Taliban from their former stronghold here in Helmand Province has put us in the weird position of being protectors of the largest crop of opium in the world.
Thanks, Geraldo. And guess what, guys? The Taliban had banned and almost completely eradicated opium in Afghanistan shortly before the U.S. invaded. Just look at these headlines. The corporate media was even lauding the Taliban's success. Fast forward to today, where over 90% of the world's heroin originates from the war-torn country. According to a report from the UN Office on Drugs and Crime, this year saw opium production surge to a record high. The report said that the harvest this May resulted in 5,500 metric tons of opium, 49% higher than last year, and more than the combined output of the rest of the world. Wow, that's a lot of heroin and a lot of money being made.
Where did Substance D come from? Why can't we stop it? The bigger this war gets, the more freedoms we lose, the more Substance D is on our streets. Can't you figure this out? Look around you. Look how far we've come. Humanity wasn't meant to live like this. Our every waking moment, tracked and traced and scanned. It's time to stop submitting to this tyranny. It's time to realize that we're being enslaved. Uh-oh, it's our tax dollars at work to protect us from ourselves. Hey guys, I used to be one of you. Stop selling out your own species.
Hello and welcome everyone to another installment of Thoughtcrime Thursdays on the Liberty Weekly Podcast. As always, I'm your host, Pat MacFarlane, recording to you solo, that is without my co-host, Jerry McCullum, after returning from the Great White North of Mississauga, Canada, where I was visiting some relatives, attending a great wedding, and experiencing the reality that is the Canadian nanny state. And that's something that I will perhaps explore more in another episode here. If this is your first time listening to our Thoughtcrime Thursdays series, let me reiterate that Thoughtcrime Thursdays is our premier program where we use the world of dystopian fiction to critique dystopic elements within our own society. Now in this episode, we will be exploring one of my favorite Philip K. Dick novels, A Scanner Darkly. But before we get started here, I would like to inform the audience of a new way to support the podcast at no additional cost to you. If you perform your regular Amazon shopping through our affiliate link, the podcast will earn a small commission from anything that you purchase. And the best part about this is that buying through our link will not cost you anything more than your regular Amazon purchase. In order to access the Liberty Weekly Amazon affiliate link, you can navigate to our website at www.libertyweekly.net. And if you go to the tab, the horizontal tab marked Amazon affiliate link, and click on it, from there it will lead you to the Amazon page where you can simply perform your regular shopping. And additionally, I will include some affiliate links to both the film and text versions of A Scanner Darkly in the show notes page, so you can check it out directly from there. Also, before we get started, I'd like to give a slight spoiler alert to those out there who have not seen the film or read the book, A Scanner Darkly. Both are very excellent. I don't feel very bad about including spoilers because the book has been out for decades, and the film, starring Keanu Reeves, Robert Downey Jr., Winona Ryder, and Woody Harrelson, has been out for about 11 years now. So if you care about spoilers, I would go see it right now. And then come back for the analysis. But for those who haven't seen or read, I will provide enough background information for you to follow along. That is, if you don't care about spoilers. And finally, please stick around until the very end of the podcast where I will talk about our plans for upcoming guests and take care of some housekeeping measures. And now, without further ado, we will begin with today's episode by providing a little bit of background on Philip Kindred Dick. The K stands for Kindred. Now, Philip K. Dick was an incredibly influential science fiction writer, best known for authoring some super trippy works, most notably The Man in the High Castle, A Scanner Darkly, and Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which, for all you nerds out there, you probably know that book was the inspiration behind the great film Blade Runner, starring Harrison Ford, for which there's a sequel planned with Ryan Gosling. I don't know about that. I don't know how I feel about that. But many other famous films have been adapted from Philip K. Dick's work, including Total Recall, Minority Report, Next, that movie with Nick Cage that came out a few years ago, and The Adjustment Bureau. Now, like most science fiction writers, Philip K. Dick got his start by writing short stories in magazines. As a general theme in early sci-fi, it was pretty difficult for writers to be taken very seriously by the mainstream literary world. So although he was widely accepted in the sci-fi community, his writing success did not necessarily translate into financial success. And as a show note on the early emergence of science fiction, I would check out Tom Woods' recent episode on the topic, although it doesn't include anything about Philip K. Dick specifically, but it does encompass the liberty movement within the science fiction community as it emerged. Now, while Philip K. Dick found success through the latter half of the 50s, it wasn't until 1963 that Philip K. Dick won the Hugo Award for writing The Man in the High Castle, which, as we all probably know, has recently become known because of the Amazon series of the same name. And personally, I didn't find that show to be too entertaining. But it had so many trendy SJW undertones, I just couldn't get into it. But since writing The Man in the High Castle, Philip K. Dick then went on to publish many more works, which are beyond the scope of this episode. Now, while I would not purport to be an expert on what Philip K. Dick believed or what his philosophy was, I hope to change that later, but his works highlighted the idea generally that reality is based on subjective perception, which may or may not be reliable, and it usually isn't in his books. Now, often his character's subjective reality is very much influenced by outside factors, which brings us to A Scanner Darkly specifically. Now, the plot of the film and the book are the same, so just bear that in mind as we go forward here. The story itself takes place in a near-future version of Los Angeles, which in the story constitutes ground zero of the outbreak of a fictional drug called Substance D. Usually ingested in tablet form, the drug Substance D causes systemic degeneration of higher brain function, which distorts the user's ability to delineate reality from mounting hallucinations. Eventually, the drug separates the left and right hemispheres of the brain, which results in a kind of chemical lobotomy. As most memorably depicted in the film, chronic addicts will become increasingly paranoid and begin to hallucinate infestations of aphids, which terrorize them until they enter a near catatonic state. And once this occurs, users either die or check themselves into New Path, a treatment facility that is owned and operated by a shadowy element of either big government or big pharma, which we will touch on later. In the beginning, the main character, Robert Archer, played by Keanu Reeves in the film, is a longtime Substance D addict. His house, which used to be a quaint suburban home, occupied by Archer, his wife, and 2 girls, has now become a drug den, shared by Archer and his burnout friends James Barris, Charles Freck, and Ernie Luckman, who are portrayed in the film by Robert Downey Jr., Rory Cochrane, and Woody Harrelson, respectively. Now, in the book, Robert Archer used to just be a normal guy. In fact, he lived in the suburbs, he had a wife, he had some kids, but one day he's doing something in the kitchen, and he brings his head up, and he smacks it on the cupboard, and it draws blood, and through that knock on the head, he realizes that he hates his life. And so he leaves his wife, or they leave him, and he begins this double life. That of Robert Archer, the Substance D addict, and that of a man known only as Fred. And I guess technically the creation of Fred precedes the creation of Robert Archer, the Substance D addict, because Fred is an undercover narcotics officer designed to infiltrate the Substance D distribution and supply chain to bust major players. And Fred basically is the code name that is given to Robert Archer when he decides to become an undercover narcotics officer. But subsequently, Robert Archer becomes a Substance D addict in pursuit of his undercover operations. So in order to protect his cover while continuing his operations or duties as a narcotics officer, Fred is always required to wear an identity censoring device known as a scramble suit. And this is whenever he is doing anything in his official capacity as Fred. So whenever he's in the department or whenever he's being interviewed or having contact in his official police capacity, he has to wear this scramble suit. And the scramble suit conceals a person's identity by disrupting the wearer's visual appearance, and instead it puts out a broadcast of a mishmash of visual identities to any onlooker. And so all officers participating in the undercover narcotics department are required to wear the scramble suits at all times to conceal their identity, unless they're out in the field. And so the effect is that to any observer, the wearer will appear as a nebulous blur of different people. And ostensibly, the wearing of this suit the purpose is to protect the identity of undercover narcotics officers and to prevent collusion within the police department, which is funny knowing what is going on behind the scenes. As an undercover narcotics officer, Fred reports to his supervisor, known only as Hank, who must also wear his scramble suit at all times. The pair discusses Fred's undercover assignments and his circle of contacts, which includes Barris, Freck, Luckman, and Robert Arctor himself. And because of Robert Arctor or Fred's continued substance D addiction, throughout his brain begins to separate, and he has a hard time delineating who he is. And to complicate matters, he is suspicious of every other member of the group, whether it's Luckman, Barris, or Arctor himself. He thinks that one of those people within his group is after him, or has known that he is actually an undercover agent. And the whole thing is just confusing, and designedly so, because, it wouldn't be a true Philip K. Dick novel without that confusion. But in order to combat the menace of Substance D, the fictional world within the story has devolved into a complete police/surveillance state. And we should see the parallels here to our current state of affairs in the United States. But despite the existence of the police state, law enforcement is still completely unable to fight the proliferation of Substance D. And in fact, throughout the story, you come to realize that mostly the people who are actually trafficking and selling Substance D are doing so with the knowledge of police, or they are police themselves, undercover officers. And as an undercover agent himself, Robert Arctor, or Frank, spends most of his time either using the drug or buying and selling it from his contact Donna, who is another drug dealer. So as part of this surveillance state, the police have developed a complete surveillance grid where all telephone traffic is monitored and the streets are surveilled by CCTV cameras. And in the film, you see Robert Arctor walking down the street, and the cameras have the ability to zoom in on his face and identify who he is and what he's doing and all that stuff. But it is a little bit less overt in the novel because, one, I don't think that Philip K. Dick could have maybe predicted that kind of technology. But two, it also presents the issue that we see within our current state of affairs, where yes, the NSA has the ability and does record and listen to every single telephone conversation and text message and stuff like that, but in the practical aspect of it, they can't monitor, the contents of every single conversation. So when they get around to it, if they want to look into it, they have that on file, but to monitor down to the minutia of every single conversation, that is just a physical impossibility as of yet. But before we get into the next section here, I just want to drop a little bit of a spoiler alert. I don't ruin the entire plot, but I guess the crux of the novel centers around this issue. But like I've mentioned before, in true Philip K. Dick fashion, the book is very disorienting to read, as it becomes increasingly difficult to tell what is actually happening from what Arctor is just hallucinating. And as I mentioned before, his brain starts to split into two hemispheres, and when he is Fred and operating as an undercover narcotics officer, it becomes more difficult for him to realize which member of the group that he is surveying he is. So he forgets that he is Arctor, and has that split and completely disassociates himself from Arctur. But by the end of the book, it is completely revealed that, of course, as you kind of figure out through the novel, that law enforcement and New Path itself, the rehabilitation clinic, are themselves purveying and orchestrating the entire production and distribution of Substance D. And for listeners of the podcast, the parallels to the modern war on drugs should be apparent here. But to bring that out more and to illustrate the real-life parallels, I wanted to talk specifically about and refer to the idea that the CIA and other U.S. governmental agencies have a major part to play in the purveying of drug trafficking and distribution throughout the United States. And in past episodes of the podcast, we've briefly discussed these topics, but I wanted to take the audience a bit further down the rabbit hole and present some evidence for these assertions, which we haven't really covered in the past here. But before I get into that, I want to quote James Corbett, who noted in an eye-opener report for BoilingFrogsPost.com that, I quote, "Indeed, as far back as one cares to go, control of the international opium trade has been a key factor in the rise and fall of empires." And so specifically when it comes to the United States government allegedly purveying the trafficking of drugs, I wanted to focus on heroin specifically. And the heroin story is so completely tied to the United States' involvement, and indeed one of the major reasons why we got involved in Afghanistan and why we are never going to leave Afghanistan ever. And so when it comes to that collusion with drug trafficking, the evidence it's a well of deceit. It's a potential well of deceit that runs deep and dark. But for the purposes of this podcast, I wanted to focus, like I said, on the Afghan opium trade. And it's because I've been reading Michel Chossudovsky's great book entitled America's War on Terrorism. And in previous editions of the podcast, I mentioned this book, and I mentioned that Michel Chossudovsky doesn't know anything about economics, and that's not true, actually. That comment came from a misinterpretation of something that he said in the book, and since I have looked at it and realized that he wasn't saying what I thought he was saying, so that's nuance there. But the book is great, and I wanted to tie it in with A Scanner Darkly, obviously, because that parallel between the purveyors of the Substance D addiction craze and the supply of it and the U.S.'s own involvement with opium and heroin in Afghanistan. And I wanted to note, as I will link in the source documents here for the show notes page, that a lot of this information is open source and openly on the record available either in government documents or through interviews with government officials. So this is not just speculation. This is documentable, tangible evidence that we have here. And so the story of the U.S. involvement in Afghanistan does not have to do with the 9/11 false flag terrorist attack and catching Osama bin Laden, as we have been led to believe. In fact, the invasion of Afghanistan was planned in advance before even the September 11th attacks, and the Patriot Act itself was written far in advance of September 11th, and all of this was just waiting in the pipeline for the false flag events of September 11th. The U.S.'s actual involvement in Afghanistan, more so than those events, have to do with corporate battles over oil pipelines and the vast stores of mineral wealth that exist in Afghanistan, mostly deposits of gold and lithium, and the pursuit of American empire and hegemony. And Corbett talks about this, which I will link in my show notes page below, that the Mesopotamian area, according to Zbigniew Brzezinski, whom we will hear more from later, is strategically important in empire building, in controlling the world. And so it has to do with the pursuit of American empire and hegemony. And of course, it also has to do with the production of opium, of which Afghanistan is the world's major supplier, producing around 90% of the world's heroin. But the modern story of opium and heroin production in Afghanistan kind of begins during the Soviet-Afghan War, and that war ran from 1979 until 1989. And during the beginning in 1979, the CIA, with the assistance of Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence Agency, began the wholesale importation of 100,000 radical Muslims from 40 different Islamic countries under the auspices of joining a holy war against the Soviet forces. And this is documentable, and it's not conspiracy theory. This is actual history, and in fact, you can find it on the Council on Foreign Relations' actual website, where they explain who the Taliban is. And despite the official narrative that the radicals were imported as a response to the Soviets, Professor Michel Chossudovsky in his book actually argues that the importation of radical Muslim jihadists happened before the Soviet invasion and was meant to entice the Soviets into invading Afghanistan in the first place, and get mired up in, Afghanistan is impossible to invade properly throughout history. And to support this claim, Professor Chossudovsky cites a 1998 interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is the former national security advisor to President Jimmy Carter. And he describes his involvement with President Carter's order in supporting anti-Soviet forces in Kabul. And I'll quote that interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski here. Brzezinski: according to the official version of history, CIA aid to the Mujahideen began during 1980, that is to say after the Soviet army invaded Afghanistan on the 24th of December 1979. But the reality, secretly guarded until now, is completely otherwise. Indeed, it was July 3rd, 1979, that President Carter signed the first directive for secret aid to the opponents of the pro-Soviet regime in Kabul. And that very day, I wrote a note to the president in which I explained to him that, in my opinion, this aid was going to induce a Soviet military intervention. Interviewer: despite this risk, you were an advocate of this covert action, but perhaps you yourself desired this Soviet entry into war and looked to provoke it. Brzezinski: it isn't quite that. We didn't push the Russians to intervene, but we knowingly increased the probability that they would. So through that interview with Zbigniew Brzezinski, we can see that the U.S. government increased the likelihood that the Russians would invade Afghanistan by radicalizing Muslim elements within the country and importing these radicals into the country, thus destabilizing a relatively stable and westernized country. In fact, if you look at some of the pictures of Afghanistan from the 1960s, you can see that women are not persecuted to the point that they are now, and we can see that terrorist activity, at least in this instance, is largely related to the U.S.'s promotion of these radicalist ideologies. In other words, the war on terrorism is almost completely a result of blowback from CIA manipulation and destabilization of Muslim countries. So during the Soviet and Afghan war, the CIA continued to arm and train these radical jihadists, and they are called the Mujahideen rebels. And so the CIA was arming and training these soldiers in an effort to support their guerrilla war against the Soviets and to mire the Soviet army up in this war that would continue to leech resources away from their infrastructure. And I guess you could argue maybe that it would work. It worked because by the end of the 1980s, you have the collapse of the United Soviet Socialist Republic. But to fund these subversive operations, the United States and Saudi Arabia relied significantly upon funds generated in the trafficking of illicit drugs through the Golden Crescent drug trade, which spans generally throughout Afghanistan, Iran, and Pakistan. And through this training, the CIA piggybacked Wahhabi fundamentalism, which created the eventual seeds within the Mujahideen of what would eventually become the Taliban. And this training was not done overtly, because if the CIA just came in and started training, these radicals in the Mujahideen, the militants would be privy of the U.S.'s involvement and the puppeteering going on behind the scenes. So in order to remain anonymous, the CIA used their agents but they also used their support through the Pakistani ISI. And we can see the effects of this because within 2 years of the CIA's involvement in Afghanistan after 1979, heroin production skyrocketed, growing to supply over 60% of the U.S. market. And the way that this would be facilitated is that as a revolutionary tax on conquered territory within Afghanistan, the Mujahideen rebels would order these peasants that were now under their control to plant opium and primarily plant opium. And after the harvesting of this opium, the opium was then transported to Pakistan using donkeys, weapons, and equipment of the Mujahideen supplied by the CIA and Saudi Arabia via Pakistani's ISI. And it was transported into Pakistan, where it was then processed into heroin in hundreds of hidden laboratories that were also run and protected by the Pakistani ISI and the Mujahideen in cooperation with the CIA and Saudi Arabia. So then, according to the UN, the annual proceeds from the Golden Crescent drug trade after this was going on expanded to reach $100 to $200 billion annually in the year 2000 alone. And in that year, it represented more than 70% of the world's opium supply just coming from Afghanistan. And that has since increased. But before, so these proceeds would come from the world's opium supply, and then they would be laundered through the Western banking system and eventually would constitute profits on the order size and scope of strategic oil interests. And also this money is used to go into black budgets to fund more CIA covert operations. And again, according to the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the slimeball think tank most influential in U.S. foreign policy, it's completely corrupted by neoconservative warmongers. And according to them, the Taliban itself emerged from the CIA radicalized Mujahideen rebels and ascended eventually to control Afghanistan from 1996 to 2001. And so, as we all know, in 2001, the U.S. military invasion of Iraq toppled the Taliban regime, which we invaded ostensibly and toppled the Taliban regime ostensibly for providing refuge for Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden. But however, what we do not usually hear is the fact that in 2000 and 2001, at the peak of opium production in Afghanistan, the Taliban, in concert with the UN, began to implement an opium elimination program in which they discouraged heavily the cultivation of opium amongst the peasantry in Afghanistan. And so as a result of this program, the supply of Afghani opium decreased in 1 year by 90%, and that's in 2000 to 2001. And in order to better explain this transition, I'm going to sample right here a 2016 interview between the Corbett Report and Michelle Chossudovsky.
But then I think foremost is that Afghanistan today produces over 90% of the world supply of heroin. And the invasion of Afghanistan occurred at a moment when the Afghan government, together with the United Nations, had implemented a far-reaching drug eradication program. In other words, they were eliminating opium and implementing crop substitution with the support of the UN. They were congratulated in the United Nations General Assembly in fall of 2001. And in fact, what the Taliban government achieved was a more than 90% collapse in opium production recorded in let's say in 2001. Now, immediately upon the influx of US troops and the occupation of Afghanistan, the production of opium sprung up to its historical levels and has increased multiple times since then. So that in effect, if we look at the logic of a multi-billion-dollar industry, which is the trade in heroin, Afghanistan was absolutely strategic And we know that both the CIA as well as the US military are complicit in the trade of opium and heroin out of Afghanistan to the Western markets.
So essentially, by studying just this one instance of U.S. governmental involvement in proliferating the drug trade itself, we can see the underlying truth behind the supply and distribution of substance D in a scanner darkly. And like I've said before, the general themes of the novel are all present in the modern war on drugs. Law enforcement's confused collusion with clandestine governmental drug suppliers, the unending proliferation of the police and surveillance state, and the futile irony of America's war on drugs, in which law enforcement unknowingly seeks to prevent its own agencies from trafficking the drugs that saturate the streets. And this just, it's like, you know, in The Wizard of Oz, the proverbial man behind the curtain kind of thing that you don't see. But at least in heroin and what we've documented here, you can see that the levers are really being pulled behind the scenes here. And so many, the sad part about it is that so many people are suffering in the United States because of this drug addiction and the proliferation of it. And that's not necessarily what you would get in a free market. And, listeners can refer to what I've written already in the free ebook that you get if you subscribe to our email list. But I would really posit that the drug war and the purveyance of the drug war and the trafficking of the U.S. drug war at least in terms of heroin and opium, is really a silent genocide that is happening, targeting some of the poorest. Not to say that drug use is isolated to poor communities, but definitely targeting the poorest members of our community. And I think a large share of the responsibility for this should be placed squarely on the shoulders of the government and the governmental agencies that purvey the war on drugs, not only by engineering the manufacture and distribution of these drugs, but by making them illegal in the first place and creating the economic conditions that lead to the destructive nature of drug use in our society. But to move on from the darkness of this topic and that statement, I wanted to point out an Easter egg in the film version where listeners will find a cameo performance by InfoWars host Alex Jones, who kind of plays the role of himself as a conspiracy theorist within the film, who's sitting on the corner and talking about how the whole Substance D affair is all run and orchestrated by the government and how the police state has come about because of the war on Substance D. And but of course the scene in the film itself, it's hard to tell if it's Arctur's hallucination of Alex Jones, which is really meta and kind of funny. But because Arctur is so hopped up on Substance D, it's hard to tell if Alex Jones is actually a hallucination or really there, because what you see is a black van pull up and grab Alex Jones and kidnap him off somewhere, and then the film just carries on as normal. So, it's hard to tell if Robert Arctur is hallucinating it or not. And I would urge you folks at home to check out that Easter egg through a link that I'll provide in the show notes page here. But if you still have not read the book or seen the film, I would highly encourage you to do so, because I've left out, even though I've included some spoilers, I've left out a fair amount of the story's plot, including some of the most, surprising spoilers. So I've also left out some characters, and I haven't really elaborated on Arctur's love interest and his drug dealer Donna, who is portrayed in the film by Winona Ryder. But like I said, as always, I've included a link to my source material in the show notes pages. This time I wanted to be a little more detailed, so I'll include the specific pages that I'm talking about in the Shusadovsky book. But I would definitely implore you not simply to accept my above assertions as truth, but to consult the source material, read it for yourself, and draw your own conclusions, especially as you see that this is not conspiracy theorizing. Like, what I'm pointing to are actual, on-the-record governmental statements by those involved. But in any case, I think that if the public were to see the war on drugs for the futile and destructive charade that it truly is, and to see that it's being purveyed because of our meddling in the Middle East, we might have a better chance of bringing it to an end. And I want to rely again on what Pablo Escobar's son, Juan Pablo Escobar, has stated, that if drugs were legalized, then the drug cartels would be gone. They would die. His quote is, they would die, quote, the day that drugs are legalized. So as this heavy edition of Thoughtcrime Thursdays comes to a close, I'd just like to reiterate that you can help fund the podcast by doing all of your normal Amazon shopping through our affiliate link, and this is at no additional cost to you. And all it takes is the extra couple of seconds that it would go to find our affiliate link, either in the below in the show notes or on the horizontal bar at the top of our website at libertyweekly.net. You just click on that and do your normal shopping, and it would really help out the podcast here, and we really would be appreciative of that. But you may also access our official merch store to pick up any Liberty Weekly apparel by following the shop tab, which is right next to the Amazon affiliate link tab at libertyweekly.net, or you can access it directly at www.zazzle.com/Liberty Weekly Podcast, and that's all one word, obviously. And in our store, you'll find a plethora of customizable Liberty Weekly merchandise, including hats, t-shirts, buttons, stickers, posters. We have tote bags, we have playing cards, and if you want to get sloshed and rant to your friends about economics, we also have Liberty Weekly beer steins and flasks. And the great thing about Zazzle and operating through their store is that they are always doing sales. There's always sales going on. So you can take advantage of those sales and get some money off of the sticker price there. And moreover, if you'd like to contribute directly to our efforts here at the podcast, we do have a direct PayPal donation link on our webpage at libertyweekly.net. If you go on the left-hand column and scroll down about halfway, you will see the direct PayPal secure donation button there. And any donation that you would feel free to give us, we would really very much appreciate, and it would go directly into our fund for web hosting and our Libsyn fund for our subscription for our podcast hosting services. And so that would help us facilitate the podcast and bring it to you. And as always, you can join the Liberty Weekly elite listeners by signing up for our email list. And email subscribers will receive a free copy of our ebook entitled Just Say No to Drug Prohibition. And it'll give you some good arguments, too, and a little historical background about the war on drugs, which feature a lot of similar actors and familiar faces towards what we have been talking about here today. But before we go, I'm excited to announce that we are about to begin the process of connecting and networking with some of our peers, including a lot of people that we mentioned in episode 11. And in fact, Jerry and I have already begun planning guest spots, and we're either going to have them on our show or we're going to appear on their show. But some of the shows we've been in contact with have been Liberty and Tech, Actual Anarchy, and Battle for Liberty. And we're really excited to work with them, and we really hope that we can help grow this podcasting community together. And I'm really looking forward, and I'm really excited to do that. But as I've mentioned multiple times in this podcast, I'll plug all the links, not only to all the source materials, but also to those podcasts that we're in talks with right now. So you can go check them out and brief yourself on, what they do and what they're about. And I'd urge you to show them your support because they really are deserving of it. And finally, before we go, please do not forget to give us a text review or rating on any platform that you're hearing this sounds. It really does help us gain exposure and get more listens and grow our audience. And that really is what we're looking to do here. So thanks again, all of you, for tuning in for another episode of the Liberty Weekly podcast. More specifically, our feature presentation, Thoughtcrime Thursdays. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode, which I took a little more detailed approach, a little more scripted approach. So please give me some feedback about what you thought about this format, and I will be sure to incorporate it into any future episodes. So once again, thank you, and we hope that you'll join us next time.